Okay, here we are. I think we are live now, as far as I can tell. And I'm Metta Spencer. I'm here in Toronto. And John Bacher is also here in Toronto in the other room, actually, using another computer of mine. And Sandy Smith is also here in Toronto, but presumably in her own home, at her own computer. And we have here Marc Barash in Berkeley, California, who is a new friend. We're just getting acquainted. So we're going to be talking tonight about the question. I'm going to phrase it as a question, although I think everybody would like to at least agree that we believe the same things about it, that planting a lot of trees can be very helpful in reducing climate change. It's a major factor. So we want to talk about that as much as we can. Let me say that Sandy Smith is a professor of forestry. When I met her, she was the dean of the forestry school at the University of Toronto, and she's an entomologist. And I guess that means she spends a lot of time looking at forest bugs. And John Bacher works for preservation of agricultural land and is very much an activist for climate change, and particularly for preservation of land and the proper use of land. And Marc Barash is in Berkeley, California, and I just found out about your work. But the rest of us don't know much about your work, and I don't know enough. So Marc, would you tell us a little bit about what it is you're doing, and especially the project that you're running in Africa?
Okay. Well, my background is I have been a journalist, a media person for prior to this for most of my life. So I was the editor-in-chief of New Age Journal. I was editor of Natural Health. New Age Journal, Natural Health, Psychology Today. Wrote 6 or 7 books, a couple of them bestsellers, and different topics. And I wrote a book on compassion here. If some of your audience might have seen a film called I Am by the director Tom Shadyac, that was based in large part on my book, and went around the world. And I decided that if I was going to talk about compassion, I should do something about it. And so I quit my long career as a media guy and decided to just do something. And I ran across somebody who taught me about agroforestry, which I'd never heard of, the planting of trees and crops together. And I thought this actually is the most compassionate thing I could do with my life, because it's food and it heals the soil, and it alleviates poverty and absorbs carbon, and generally is healing. It's a regenerative process. And having written a lot of books on healing as well as on compassion, I thought this is a way to extend the through line of my work into the world. So I sort of entered into this pretty naively as somebody who was kind of a fan of the work of a German artist named Joseph Beuys, who said that art should be social sculpture, and that artists should be more involved in sculpting the world, changing the world, and that it didn't belong between just the pages of a book or on a screen or on a canvas in a museum. And I took that very seriously. So I sort of took my knowledge of networking with people and the arts and presentation and media to begin with, and just launched myself into this. And it's a particular tree. I actually didn't start with the particular tree. I started with we planted probably 25 or 26 different biodiverse species around the world in 9 countries, starting in Ethiopia. But when I was in Ethiopia, where I also contracted a near fatal case of malaria, which is my kind of initiation into all of this, I also encountered something called the Moringa Tree, which I'd never heard of. And Moringa trees are very fast-growing trees that can grow on degraded land, and whose leaves are 33% high-quality protein with all amino acids. And it's drought-tolerant, and it can play well with other species, so you can grow it in biodiverse agricultural settings. And I kind of filed it away, and I thought someday I'm going to do something with this tree. And then we began to plant it in we have 85 schools in Kenya. Eco-agriculture is one of the subjects that we teach. And I started bringing it to Kenya so that the kids could see it, and kind of, it grows fast. It grows, in 4 or 5 months, you have harvestable leaves. So it's good for nutrition. A lot of these kids are undernourished. You can actually eat the leaves. And it just kind of caught on. And before I knew it, all the communities were planting it. And we had maybe 80,000 trees planted. So I decided that I would try to, fast forward a few years to make a regenerative business. And I teamed up with a guy who used to be the head of operations for Kraft Foods and had been working in Nigeria for about the same amount of time that I'd been doing this work. And we started a business in Southeast Nigeria to grow these trees and create a high protein powder from the leaves. So we planted 1 million trees, and we have 100,000 farmers that are working with us on this project. And we would like to bring a new source of protein to the world that also regenerates land and communities.
Well, okay. Congratulations, and thank you for your contribution. This is wonderful. I want to start off with our general question, if I may. And I must say, let me preface it by saying that I'm phrasing it as a question. Do trees, wood planting maybe 1 trillion trees, actually reduce global warming? And the thing that surprised me was going on Google today and checking and finding that some of the first articles that come up are ones that kind of say no. The answer is no. Or at least the answer is very, very qualified.
Well, it depends who you read. And I think Sandy is the expert here, and would probably be aware of the Canadian study that was done that supposedly debunked that trees would be good for the climate. But I think there were tremendous flaws in that study. And the New York Times, for some reason, chose to highlight this a couple of years ago and said basically planting trees would increase global warming. And the reason for that was they were only counting trees in northern latitudes, which would form a dark mass, supposedly, which would absorb heat, and then that heat would be convected to the poles and make everything worse. But that was a very flawed thesis. And Sandy, you probably know a lot more about it.
Yeah, tell us that, Sandy.
Yeah, no, I wasn't going to actually comment on that because it's this area. It's like climate change, 10 years or so ago. Everyone still sort of depends how you look at the problem and what parameters you include in your analysis. And so, yes, certainly studies from Canada tend to deal with the natural forest because that's what we have a lot of. And it's where our concerns or our interests are, is how we position ourselves politically on this international stage of how trees are going to help or not help. It's sort of about, I guess it's about us. I mean, I think what is the concern really is this trade-off between development, agriculture, and forestry. Where you see losses of trees is often because of agricultural land clearing. And I wouldn't say it's local, small level agriculture. It's sort of large scale issues around deforestation and degradation of lands. And we see it even in developed countries, but certainly in developing countries where it's harder to regulate. So I think that's where I kind of come from. And I don't have the data on my own fingertips. I tend to work in forest health. As you said, Metta, I'm an entomologist. So I have tended to see how we lose forests and focus on those issues. And if we could return those landscapes to forested landscapes, or at least more forested, I think there's a tremendous potential to mitigate climate change, certainly because of the carbon stores. Forests are our main place in the globe to store carbon. So if we're going to be producing a lot of carbon, and I'm not condoning that in any way, but we would want to be able to lock it up, and we can lock it into wood and keep it for long periods of time. The other piece is water. And I think a lot of these analyses to come back to that other study, is they forget the whole role of forests in vegetated landscapes like forested areas on terrestrial lands, the movement of water and the evapotranspiration and just the hydrological cycle, which in and of itself is cooling. So, I guess without throwing out all the stats there, I would disagree with them, and it would depend what sort of data you take.
Well, they were also not looking at tropical forests. They were looking at northern forests,
which is where our biggest degradation is.
Yeah. Right.
And
so you get a lot faster growth rate in the tropics. The soil, everything is different in the tropics.
Everything's different. So it was, as I say, it was a Canadian bias because we have all these boreal, relatively still natural landscapes, which means that's our focus. And I guess we don't think more broadly. And
well, it's a very peculiar set of articles that came out around that. One, why the press seized on that particular study was really strange. It was almost
it's interesting because I find that that's what people, or maybe it's you're the media guy, Marc, but maybe it's trying to appear to be balanced. It was like the climate.
Well, I think it's also that basically, dog bites man is not a story, but man bites dog is a story.
The novelty. The novelty.
It's like, oh, gee, trees are bad for you.
Are bad. Yeah.
That's interesting. So there was that, and then there was another article shortly after that I noted in the Times where they said that because of the decrement in food production that climate change was going to cause in staple crops like corn and wheat, maybe a 20% per decade or something like that, some large amount. Terrifying.
Sorry.
That it would that harvest would become smaller from climate change. So they said, well, we have to cut down more forests in order to make more farmland, And there was no thought of, well, wait a minute, what about agroforestry? What about forests and trees, which is the most ancient form of agriculture, which has been practiced since the beginning of time, which 600 million people on this planet still practice, providing 70% of the food. So agribusiness has been putting out a myth that they are providing all the food for the 7 billion, soon to be 12, or let's see where we wind up. But that's actually absolutely untrue. And in fact, agribusiness is causing at least 30% of global warming through destroying soil, outgassing, mechanical outgassing of equipment. They are part of the problem. They're not the solution.
Yeah, and I think as a forest educator, just to jump in, I've spent a large part of my career not debunking, but trying to straighten the perspective on it's not forestry that's taking trees away. It is, large-scale agriculture that actually is removing trees from landscapes. And maybe that's, again, a Canadian bias, but, the thing is that we tend to get confused over what's actually the drivers here. And in the long run, loss of trees, I look at these landscapes in California where you put intensive monocultures, high input, and mainly water. What worries me a lot on landscapes is water and salinization from repeated irrigation on landscapes that don't have any, there's no agroforestry, there's no hydrological cycle.
Well, the thing is that it's dead soil because agribusiness treats soil like it would treat an open pit mine. It's really an extractive industry, and it leaves nothing. So the soil is dead. It has no biota, no microbiome. It doesn't hold water because the hydrological cycle has been destroyed. So it really is a
I would like to
spiral.
Jump in, Joe.
I think I did a Google search as well before, and I certainly agree with all the negative comments you've made about this literature that tries to debunk afforestation. The thing that hasn't come up so far is a big reason for the mess we're in, both carbon emissions and methane emissions, was the burning of forests for agriculture. This was a terrible devastation in the late 19th century, and studies have been suggested that half the carbon, methane, contributing to this crisis was caused. So we have to look at both, protecting our forests from more of this destruction and extending, the forest canopy, rolling back some of this destruction.
Well, it's also soil, which is only come into the conversation, pretty recently, the popular conversation. Soil organic matter sequesters carbon. Healthy soil draws down carbon to an extraordinary degree.
It's about a third or more, isn't it, in the forest? Yeah,
exactly. And then if you do biodiverse perennial agriculture, meaning you have trees and crops, and you have a permaculture environment, you're sequestering lots and lots of carbon. So there's a tremendous interest all of a sudden in soil carbon. It's pretty new. I don't think the data is really there. A lot of claims being made, but there's no question. You can hold soil in your hand, agribusiness soil and soil that's been cared for. What is rich and dark and brown, and it also is based on the mycorrhizal processes. It's not, they're bacteria and they're kind of fungal processes in the soil. And if you can increase the fungal processes, it sequesters a lot of carbon and becomes this healthier, produces food that is nutrient dense. That's another thing that's not spoken about very much. If you're growing food on agribusiness land, land that's demineralized, dead soil, basically, you're not getting much nutrition. Even if it's organic, you're not necessarily getting nutritional density. You get that from living soil. And so there's a lot of debates going on about this now. For example, at the Natural Products Expo West, there was a launch of a regenerative organic standard by Patagonia and Rodale and a bunch of other brands, saying that, organic's just not enough. It's not, you don't necessarily have healthy soil if you're growing organic. So you have to add this regenerative component. And then the question is, well, how do you sell the consumer market on that? Consumers are willing to buy organic because primarily, besides the aura of virtue, it's they don't want to have chemicals. They don't want chemicals in their body. They don't want their children to have chemicals. There's a kind of a personal dimension to it. So thus far, the regenerative conversation has been more moral, that we should regenerate land. But there are nutritional dimensions to it that could actually even affect the health status of large numbers of people if we were growing that way. And the basic concept with regeneration as well, beyond sustainability, is we have to renew the environment because we have an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if we stopped emitting CO2 from every tailpipe and smokestack on Earth tomorrow, it would not solve the climate crisis. We actually have to draw down the legacy carbon. And there are very few things that can do that. The oceans are acidified. They've absorbed all they can absorb. That just leaves soil and vegetation. And we have to actually embark on a planetary project of massive regeneration of soil and vegetation.
Okay. Tell me how to do that. The thing that I was fascinated by for a year or two was biochar. And can somebody speak to that? Is that a...
I was going to jump in on that before when Marc was talking, because we're doing work on that, and I started looking at soil again. As an entomologist, I wasn't really thinking about soils, but as I work a lot with invasive species, and in Canada, earthworms are invasive species in the sense that our soils never had earthworms, and once you start looking at earthworms and the processes in the soil, you start to appreciate the shifts in mycorrhizae. I had a colleague of mine in Cornell that sort of said, I'll give you $1,000 if you can find an invasive plant, garlic mustard, without earthworms. And I've never claimed my $1,000 yet. So I know earthworms and these changes that would have come anyway are changing soil processes. So we got into looking at, okay, you can't get rid of earthworms. They probably would have come anyway post-glaciation in a country like Canada where the glaciers are receding. Worms were coming. So now what we have to look at is processes to try and reinvigorate as processes speed up in the soil. And biochar was one of the biggies that we've been very interested in. And just a few of the experiments we've been running over the last couple of years show, in particular, my area now, which is a lot more urban forestry, is that biochar is extremely helpful in conditions of drought where you have really dry, impacted soil. And salts, we are finding it mitigates the impacts of road salts, which you see a lot in cities, but also in highly irrigated, salinized areas. So I'm still infatuated with it, Metta.
That's wonderful.
You should probably explain what it is. Somebody should tell what biochar is.
Yeah.
Folks, I don't think the audience is going to know.
Charcoal. It's just charcoal, activated charcoal, I guess. Pyrolyzed, wood or carbon, any organic matter that is pyrolyzed, meaning burned under anaerobic conditions. So it's not completely oxidized. And so the material is available in the soil. It basically locks carbon down for thousands of years. That is a very slow release. And getting back to the mycorrhizae and the fungi in the soil and microbes, we're seeing that it acts because it's layered as it's created in the burning pyrolyzing process. It layers, which allows microorganisms, and we're seeing small collembola, small invertebrates, mites, that are part of this soil processes living there. Like it creates little microhabitats in the soil. I don't know if I explained the biochar part the best.
No, you did exactly that. Although now torrefaction is also coming online, right? But the interesting thing about biochar, it was kind of conflated with, but it's not unrelated to something called tierra preta in the Amazon. So it was not realized until pretty recently that 30% of the Amazon was an agroforestry project by the indigenous people. It looks wild. It doesn't look like a farm, but it was a polyculture, multi-level farming technique that went from the roots all the way to the canopies. And when the settlers at Spanish, whoever came, they just thought it was wild nature. So one of the reasons that this was so prolific was that the indigenous people also knew how to use essentially biochar. They have this black earth that's incredibly fertile. It would contain bits of potsherds and kitchen waste. They just knew how to manage soil in a way that we completely forgot.
If I could see, one of the big achievements of afforestation in Ontario was reclaiming degraded soil that had been desertified. The term in the past was blow sand conditions. And there's huge areas of the province like the Oak Ridges Moraine, the La Rose Forest, Norfolk County, where these sand wastelands essentially have been returned to healthy soil cover by planting trees, by afforestation. And this is not properly understood. I saw a documentary, The Land in Between, that looked at the edge of the Canadian Shield. And actually, there is no land in between. The land had become so degraded that it looked like it was, semi-forest. What we're thought of alvar habitats were actually degraded forests. And when the area became reforested, the soil had improved. North America, a lot of the continent was managed as agroforestry by native people. The maple, the black walnut, the hickory, the beech, these food-related trees were deliberately cultivated and encouraged. And one of the things I was stunned to find a real pioneer in reforestation or afforestation in Ontario, George Johnson, Mohawk chief, grew these trees in a nursery he established and got the Ontario Fruit Growers Association enthused about reforestation. And one odd thing, Marc, I'm glad that you're working with the Kraft Corporation because the Kraft family.
He left Kraft. In a hub.
They began in Fort Erie at the same time as the hero of afforestation in Ontario, Edmund Zavitz, the same community in the 1890s they came from. They later moved to Chicago, but it's surprising these historical connections and how they can be used to encourage good things.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book called Drawdown. which I am very.
I was on the.
Pardon?
I was on the advisory committee of the book.
Perfect. It's sort of indirectly how I got to you, I think. Interested in drawdown. But one of the things they did was make a list of about 100 things that you can do or could be done to reduce global warming. And then they did quantification and tried to estimate how effective each of these methods would be, and they rank ordered them. And I noticed that they ranked tropical forestry as quite high. It wasn't the very top one. The top one was actually refrigeration, which is a very, very different, very surprising thing, because the coolants used in refrigerators are extremely dangerous and bad for the environment, for the global warming. Anyway, they put these tropical forestry up quite high, and then quite a bit below, they had, I guess, boreal forests, or I forgot how they called it, but non-tropical forests, such as we have here in Canada. And that is apparently, they do call it a valuable thing, but it's not as important.
It doesn't absorb as much carbon.
Right.
Tropical
and then the other thing about the biochar that sort of surprised me was, because I had read at one point that biochar, if used in the optimum amount way, could offset something like 12% of the carbon emissions that are being emitted every year. 12% would be quite an achievement and quite a wonderful thing to do. And I would have thought then biochar would be quite high on that rank ordering, but it's actually quite low.
Well, there's a lot of hype around these things. There was the biochar industry. So they wanted to say, everybody wants to say they have the final ultimate solution. I don't care if it's renewable energy or as far as.
I don't think there is much of a biochar industry, and I think
there was trying to be. And believe me, I knew the people who were creating it, and they were hyping. So you got to watch the hype.
It's still
all right. Well, I don't know, but I just wonder. Somebody else told me that he thought that was a mistake, that biochar really should rank higher on the list. But I don't know whether we can do that. No? Anyway, Sandy, your thoughts about that?
Well, I guess I was going to say, I think biochar is still, I would say in an infancy. We're still struggling. Again, it's back to there's so much variation and variability, and there's the hype around it, which I guess to me, I think lacks scientific rigor. There's a lot of interest in it because of policy and magic bullets that, yes, 12% or whatever the number may be. I don't think we have, as a scientist in me, we don't have the data. I'd like to see more of consistency, because biochar, as I said, is just organic matter. So what's that organic matter? I've been working with, they've just become the first Ontario commercial industry to produce it. The Halliburton Forest has set up their production, and it's commercially available out of Halliburton, the town here in Ontario. And I guess what I was going to say, at least it's a consistent product, so they know the input, which is a wood source. They have a sawmill, so they're taking particular material, and they can produce a standardized product that then you can actually go out and test and figure out. You get better estimates. Like right now, I think the numbers, whether it's climate change or carbon or whether trees can help or biochar, people are throwing numbers around, like, what do they call them? Manhole covers or something. Like we're throwing some numbers around, and we're all scrambling. Well, the scientists in us are scrambling to try and get some real data so that these numbers are more realistic and we can build better models that actually.
Yeah, well, it's why I went into the agroforestry thing, with a clean conscience, making claims that what we're doing is going to, reverse global warming necessarily. It is feeding people. It is restoring soil. It is providing livelihoods. It doesn't, it is preserving and increasing biodiversity. So there are a lot of benefits. It's like Pascal's wager, I mean, you really want to do it because it is the right thing to do. And if it sequesters a lot of carbon, all the better. And there are people like, I'm sure, Sandy, Ratan Lal's work at Ohio State, So again, controversial, but Ratan Lal says if you had 2% more carbon sequestration worldwide, you would reverse climate change and CO2 levels to go back to 1870. The French government has adopted is it 4 per thousand, Sandy?
Marc, repeat that because it sounded like a big number. Say it again.
So this is Ratan Lal saying that if you know, and it's a big if. He said, you know, if 2%, if we increased soil carbon or soil, I think it's actually if we increase soil cover, isn't that right, Sandy?
Yeah,
by 2%.
not sure.
I think it's topsoil because we're losing topsoil. By the way, the general statistic is we have 60 harvests left on the planet, so we better start paying attention to soil, or we won't eat. But in any case, if we increase that by 2% a year, we would reverse climate change and go back to essentially the 1870 pre-industrial levels. That's his contention. Again, controversial. The French government has adopted another standard. It's 4 per thousand. So they're trying to increase soil by a factor of, I guess, 0.04, would it be, per year. There's a lot of interest in this idea of increasing topsoil.
Okay, what else can you do?
If I could maybe, I'd like to thank previous speakers for the caution about biochar. Frankly, one thing I'm worried about is that maybe people might, you know, burn trees to create biochar.
Well, that's exactly why it wasn't made part of the protocols by the UN, because the fear was if you monetized it, as in the carbon market, you would have people planting forests just to burn them down to make biochar. So it was a big controversy about that. Exactly what you're saying.
So how do you improve your soil then? 2% a year. How would you do that besides biochar? I mean, you do agroforestry. It can't just be trees. It has to be trees and agriculture. And you have to incentivize the people live in these places, you know? So they have to get something out of it. Not just going to plant trees because people in Canada think it's a good idea. They're going to plant trees if they can feed themselves, if there's a market for the products that they're growing, if it's consonant with their own indigenous methodologies. You know, it really takes a lot of in situ understanding of the people on the ground. And plus, there are an estimated 5 billion plus acres of degraded land in the world that identified by the UN capable of being regenerated and restored. And those are not just barren areas of desert. Those are places where poor people live, scratching out a living. So that if we help those people to create biodiverse perennial agricultural systems, agroforestry systems, that would have a tremendous effect on climate change, poverty, malnutrition, hydrological cycle, indeed, water. Also, they found that forests make clouds, right? That wasn't totally understood before, but there are particles coming from and being convected up. They make clouds, cloud cover. So if you have a forest, you eventually get cloud cover above that forest. Oh. Okay.
That's what I was trying to say, the water cycle, you know.
The hydrological cycle is restored by tree planting.
That's absolutely true. And that has been one of the major reasons for forest conservation is to protect watersheds. And this has been very well documented. One very significant forest scientist, Raphael Zahn, did experiments where the U.S. Forest Service they went out and deliberately deforested watersheds and then scientifically compared it to a watershed in good tree cover and showed the difference it would make. And this is also that afforestation is part of a strategy for mitigating the effects of climate change, of stopping streams from drying up.
Exactly.
And also, go on.
I was just going to say that the whole notion of restoration dropped out of the conversation early on in the environmental movement, right? Which was based on these kind of John Muir ideas of, you know, pristine nature, hand of man and woman should not ever touch nature. Well, that's not the way we've lived on this planet. We've been stewards of the garden. You know, we've been part of the ecosystem, and if we participate in the regeneration and renewal of that ecosystem, we can actually save ourselves kind of at the last minute. But that conversation, what didn't exist hardly 10 years ago, was about sustainability. Sustainability hasn't worked. Unfortunately, it's entropic. It leaks. 350.org should now be 410.org. It didn't work. So we have to do this restoration, renewal, regeneration work starting now if we want to have any hope at all.
Yeah, well, thank you. I approach a lot of this matter as an environmental historian, which is one of the things I'm worried about biochar. If you look at the historical beginnings of conservation in medieval Europe, it was to restrict the charcoal burners destroying the forests. And there have been very impressive results from this ecological restoration, and it's very sad that it's something unknown.
Yeah, it doesn't require biochar. I mean, these methods again are being used by half a billion smallholders around the world to produce a lot of food. There are farms or eco farms or agroecology farms in Mexico that have 70 species per hectare. This is known and applicable, and we're just beginning to rediscover it. It doesn't take anything that exotic, and the knowledge base already exists. We just haven't been accessing it.
Well, this is true, and one of the best examples in Tanzania, I'm sure you're familiar with the chaga at Mount Kilimanjaro, totally forest cover, canopy, and they get a phenomenal amount of food products out of that forest.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. I'd like somebody to explain to me this business you're suggesting. Is it silvo agriculture? I don't know. But it's some combination of foresting land and raising crops on it.
Well, this as agroforestry, there's silvopastoralism also, which actually includes livestock. And that's a whole other conversation.
It's a word that shows up on this drawdown list. There's a couple of words there that were unfamiliar to me. I would have thought if you're going to have trees, you can't also be raising crops underneath them because there's not enough sunshine, right?
Yes, but no, that's not true.
Depends on the crop.
Depends on the crop. I mean, these systems, as I say, they're thousands of years old. They figured out how to put 25 crops in. Some of them fix nitrogen. Some of the trees, like the Moringa tree, is spindly. A lot of light comes through. It's perfect for alley cropping.
And sometimes, like coffee, you need to grow it under shade, or ginseng, or many of these crops that we want the product from require shade or a quasi shade. So it's perfect. It's ideal for agroforestry systems.
Yeah, our agribusiness is really a bit moronic. It's simple-minded, so we don't understand anything about how life actually, how the web of life functions. When you have a monocrop, it's pretty idiotic way to do things.
The ginseng is a very good example. One of the sad things that this native plant, native to our forests here in Ontario, was over-harvested to the extent that it's endangered species, but it can be properly grown and profitable.
My goodness, how many pieces of ginseng per year would you like even a very avid consumer use? Maybe half a cup full? I don't think a lot of this.
Well, think about coffee, Metta. Coffee actually likes to grow better under partial shade, so and in fact, agroforestry works wonderfully for that. If the local communities in the developing countries or tropical areas where coffee's the mainstay, if they could be encouraged and supported in this kind of more sustainable approach, that would be even better than these.
I think the overall thread here is that you have to give Indigenous people a livelihood, a reason to do this. You can't just wave your arm and have them, quote, save the environment. There are these cash crops. This is being ginseng, for example. I know projects in Appalachia now where they're finding ways to do agroforestry in the U.S. It's applicable in a lot of, with chestnuts, apples on farms. There are all kinds of efforts going on, kind of under the radar. And it could be an enormous change, a sea change or whatever, land change in the way agribusiness is practiced. And in fact, I think agribusiness needs to be radically disrupted, especially the way it functions. I work in the developing world. And you look at a country like Nigeria, where $20 billion is being spent importing grain when they could be growing their own food. But that's how the system has been operating for a long time.
And you look at Indonesia with the, deforestation to put in palm, oil palm that is being sold around the world. So diversity disappears for those monocultures. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's being driven by these external powers that the locals get caught up in.
Well, the elites are conspiring with the corporations, and it's an extractive industry. It's just like copper mining. And leaves a big open pit when you're done.
When you walk away,
you've got dead land.
Right, and
but
people.
You've extracted the value and dead people or malnourished people. So the late capitalism is a threshing machine, for the planet, and it's extracting money from the value system is completely upside down, and that's another cultural, economic, social job that we have to do, is to revise our values.
I think this discussion should be more about agriculture than forestry at some level. Is the impacts. As I said, my undergraduate degree is BSc Aggie. I'm an Aggie from the University of Guelph in Canada, which, is, I look back, not in shame, but I look back and sort of go, wow, what a mindset, brainwashing almost as an undergraduate in that system about how that was the way forward. And I moved in graduate school into forestry, and just a completely different way of looking. Yes, we have plantations. We may even approach monoculture kind of replantings, but certainly in Canada, we're never able to keep those. It becomes nature takes over and drives that system. So I look back at agricultural systems, and I was involved with a project at Guelph there, over 20 years ago now, probably, agroforestry. They were trying to introduce trees into the agricultural system, this school that's supposed to be leading edge on how you should be farming. And do you think there was a single farmer or uptake on that agroforestry? In fact, I hear they've plowed it under a couple of years ago. The whole experiment that now would be reaping benefit, that you would look and say, these trees that have been planted intercrop with agricultural systems, how is it playing out now? We dug it under.
Yeah. But see, some of that is the economic system as well, because we're talking about return on investment, right? So we are doing a conference on May 1st in San Francisco called Regenerate 2018, regen18.com, for those of you who want to look it up. And it's really looking at some of the economic drivers for this, right? Yeah. So, you have to have capital that moves at the speed of nature. You have to have long-term investment that's willing to let a tree grow for 10 years and get the investment back then. So we're looking for, what is a regenerative investment structure, right? How do we have to have a regenerative society, a regenerative civilization? It takes a lot of moving parts that have to work in concert to make a genuine transformation. But if we don't make that transformation, we're not going to make it as a civilization, so we have to figure it out.
Let me ask you about numbers, because when I first thought of doing this particular show, asking, is it a good idea? How much good will it do if we plant a lot of trees? First question is, of course, how many trees are you talking about? And so I tried to Google it and say, well, how many trees would it take? And the answer seems to be a hell of a lot. They were talking about something like 900 million.
No. Probably more like 900 trillion.
900 billion or something. And the next number would be to round it off to 1 trillion.
That wouldn't be enough either.
That wouldn't be enough either.
No, and besides which, it's not just trees, Metta. Trees in isolation is really the wrong way to look at it. It's not just a bunch of trees now, and these are whole systems. So you have to heal the whole system, which is trees, soil, the ecology, the fauna, the flora, below the soil, above the soil, the people who live there. If you don't look at whole systems, it'll never work. So I think trees are just the wrong way to, it's the wrong metric.
Yeah, thank you for that comment of looking at the whole system. Like a lot of food could be put on grown on the rooftops that are flat. And then the land could be reforested in trees. You have to look at these things comprehensively. This, immense tracts of monocultural food crops does not have to be. You can grow food in environments like a greenhouse where you can also treat water pollution problems. To look at all these issues holistically. Another way of dealing with global warming is that you can substitute through selective forestry products like concrete and cement that are big contributors to global warming by tree products. It's trying to cloak the earth in a green mantle as carefully as we can.
Also, there are techniques now for creating types of building materials that absorb carbon. So there really is an urban component to this. It's really like the bioregion includes farms, it includes cities. It's all one, as you were saying, holistically. It's one system. So we have to look at every aspect of what we do as a civilization and say, how can we go from extractive to regenerative? How can we change the way we do things? And then if we do that, in each area that we look at, we have a shot.
Yeah, and I was going to say, just working with in urban forestry these days a lot more is to, I think city dwellers, wherein there's a lot more of us now than there have ever been, tend to think about the city in isolation, and they don't appreciate that, no city functions on.
Oh, Sandy, you've gone silent. Sandy, not hearing you. Sandy? John, are you hearing Sandy?
No.
Marc, are you hearing Sandy?
No.
Okay.
No, she's come back on.
Oh.
But I'm on, but I don't have. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Now I see my green button going up and down. I forget what I was on about, but
yeah, whatever you were saying, we didn't get.
You were saying about the urban environment.
That cities, people who live in cities, and there's more and more of us, they tend to think of them as isolated or insular in some way. And certainly in Canada, this idea of I'm in the city, but then I go up north or I go out of the city. But no city survives without inputs from outside, and it has outputs that go outside. So I guess I was trying to come back to the point of holistic, that the danger of being city dwellers is that we tend to think that we don't have as much impact. I think we're starting to understand that better, but I think there's a big chasm between what we do here. I'm sitting in downtown Toronto and 6 million people around me. I tend to think, well, that doesn't really matter for the boreal, but in fact, all the thinking matters very much. And so, yeah, I guess I was going to add from before the conversation, to me, it's about land use and sort of having a holistic worldview of land use. And also, if I would relate to my Indigenous colleagues, it's this sense of responsibility for what we do rather than just the taking. It's the sense of participating. I think I said this morning, Metta, when we were talking, it's having a relationship with where we are. And I don't know if we can get that to the people who are still just looking at it as a cash crop, whatever they do.
Excuse me for being the one always drawing us back to things like numbers and quantifiable things while you're into spiritual realms, Sandy, or something like that. So okay. I want some quantifiable things. So I have read someplace that that a tree is actually very effective in sequestering carbon while it's young and growing. But then in its later years, it's not that useful. And that therefore what we should do is plant a lot of trees, and when they get to be middle-aged, cut them down.
Yeah, that was debunked. I think Sandy will agree also that, they found out mature forests actually sequester, the most effective, because they've settled into a steady state.
Yeah, and the problem with that kind of... Go ahead, Marc.
Yeah, no, go ahead. It's your field.
I did want to jump in. The problem with that kind of analysis, and someone like myself working with animals rather than plants directly, is that yes, of course, that young forests grab and sequester and carbon and store it and hold on to it. And as they decline or as they get older, they store less carbon as quickly. But that carbon gets translated into insects and microorganisms, and in particular mycorrhizae, fungi. The fungi of the world, if I had to start over, I'd probably become a mycologist, because the fungi are so adapted to carbon. So that carbon, it's not in the tree, but it's in so much that was the tree. We often say a tree is more alive when it's dead than when it's alive, because it's full of everything else that's living on it, and all that life is full of carbon. So I think it's very much a challenge of how you measure this. And I think we conveniently forget the many pieces if we're just measuring what a tree is.
Yeah, I mean, the great poet Wendell Berry said you have to solve for pattern. Solve for pattern. You have to use whole systems at all times, because they're never not.
Yeah, it's not just that piece you look at. And I'm not trying to get away from your numbers, Metta. And I think the numbers, we can go out and we can get those numbers from whoever's been looking at them, or my colleagues and myself who are measuring them. But it's appreciating that the numbers aren't in and of themselves the be all. They I don't know. I mean, it does appeal to scientists, but it's making the connections that is pretty powerful. So,
well, if I could give a number, the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario wrote an excellent report saying Ontario 1 billion trees needed. That's just for Southern Ontario, and that was primarily to deal with problems like phosphorus pollution of Lake Erie, that because farm fertilizers are running into streams and killing them, you essentially need 1 billion trees in Ontario to deal with this very specific.
But that's where I say that if you don't solve for pattern, and if you don't look at this regeneratively rather than sustainably, it'll never work. Because basically you just described the sustainable model. One part of the system does the damage, another part of the system fixes it, and you're at zero sum. A company pollutes and then it unpollutes, and each division makes money. The unpolluting and the polluting makes money. That's not solving the problem. The problem is looking at the entire system, and why is that kind of form of agriculture being practiced, and how do we transform the agriculture so that it's not destructive? And then you can't just have one part of the system being destructive and the other part trying to fix it. We have to actually have a pattern recognition and then solve for that pattern.
Well, one of the things I could hope, I know Sandy is aware of this, the Garnaska watershed, which at one time was only, I think, 9% forested, and now is around 40% forested. And these problems of phosphorus pollution, agricultural spoiling the countryside are no longer present. But how many people are aware of these exact?
Well, here's your chance to make them aware of it. That's why we hold these things. What if you had to give one little bit of advice that you would like for everybody to take away from this discussion and practice and embody it in their everyday life? What would each of you suggest as a simple practice that would make some difference, that would actually help with the topic, particularly the topic that we started with, which is global warming?
Well, I mean, I'm going to give a shameless plug for my foundation, the Green World Campaign, which is greenworld.org, and we're planting trees in Africa for about 30 cents each. And it's we don't pay ourselves, so it's all pro bono, and it's about the most effective charity on the planet for doing agroecology work and tree planting and working with elders to save sacred forests and educating tens of thousands of children who learn agroecology in our programs. It's the best dollar you'd ever spend. So greenworld.org.
Terrific. Okay. Sandy, what would you give?
I don't have a plug, but you know, I think it's about the land, and maybe it references what Marc's talking about, but it's about respect for the land and a sense of responsibility for the land, that we have a relationship with the land. It is about land, and that's why trees are so important in this conversation, because they can't run away, they can't move, they are there on the land, and it is forcing us to look at that. And I hope it continues. I think my greatest fear is that, like climate change or whatever, with trees, if the young ones aren't growing, aren't being replaced, if we're not putting them back or helping to put them back or promoting them, then there is no forest 50, 100, 200, or 1,000 years from now. Like, it takes a long time. It's easy to cut one, but it's not easy to grow it. And huge challenge. But if we recognize the relationship with the land and our responsibility to it, I think maybe we have a hope. And it's probably tied to what Marc's talking about a little bit.
Can I ask a technological? Here I am. This is not typical for me to be.
I would like to say something.
Trying to sound like a kind of person, but there is a technology that I found fascinating, and I'd like your comments on it because it's not a particularly spiritual thing. It's the use of drones. Apparently, you can have a drone full of seeds with inside little pellets which have all kinds of nutrients, and I don't know what goes on inside those pellets. But the drone can fly over land that is not usable and not accessible to people who want to, actually do the planting themselves physically. And it can shoot these things into the ground. And it can shoot hundreds or thousands of these things per hour and reforest a whole area just by the simple, like shooting a pellet into the ground. It's not very romantic, but can somebody tell me, is there a future for this?
Well, Metta, this is nothing.
They're friends of mine, yeah.
We've been doing this in Ontario since the 1950s, and I urge people to read Ken Armson's book, Ontario Forests. This aerial seeding has been done for the jack pine, which is one of the major trees of the boreal forest, and it's been done very successfully. And I was shocked. It was only because I read his book that I knew about this. And a lot of people make these, oversweeping generalizations attacking the forestry sector. We have, 70 years of essentially doing what you're talking about in this problem.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, and I'm glad.
But this is a lot more advanced. I mean, I think they're called Biocarbon Partners, and it's a NASA scientist and a man named Tom Chi, who was at Google, who lives out here actually in San Francisco, and they're talking about planting billions of trees that way.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, I'm aware of what we've done here, and that's always my first answer is that we've flown it and we've done it. But the drones, of course, are very different or greater capacity. We hopefully, we're a lot better at it. I guess my concern is always, you said we're planting millions of hectares, Metta, whatever the numbers. Again, I get worried about these big numbers, and I'd like to know what's the survival rate. We never had a good survival rate on the aerial seeding, even though great technology. But I am thrilled that if we can get to places that we couldn't any other way, let's go for it. It's not that expensive. I guess once NASA's got the technology, we should use it. But, let's be careful that it's not, again, the panacea or the silver bullet. I still think it's we can bring technology, but it is about people, because no one will use the technology unless we want it. You can have the best science in the world. That's what I tell my students. But if people don't want to do it and don't see the value in it, it's not happening. Right now, what's running the value is money and capitalism. And that's where I see agricultural systems driving to a place that doesn't allow for Indigenous or local communities. They have to almost grab it back, you know, they have to fight to get it back, because it's being run by capitalism. So sorry, I digressed.
No, it's not digressing, but also I respond to your earlier question, Metta, about what people can do. I think this is the epitome of thinking globally, acting locally. You should be vigilant around your community, every opportunity you can have to protect forests from being deforested, and also to have more, and more trees and more vegetation of all sorts.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think that winds it up. You've all had a wonderful contribution to this discussion. I really appreciate it. And I want to say just one little thing before we wrap it up. And that is, I want to mention something called How to Save the World in a Hurry, a forum that we will be holding on the 30th and 31st of May here in Toronto at the Bacher Center at U of T. And it's a project attempting to identify the most promising things that we can do to reduce the risk of 6 different catastrophes: war and weapons, mainly nuclear, global warming, which we've certainly been talking about tonight, famine, pandemics, massive radiation exposure through things like a reactor blow up or something like Fukushima or Chernobyl or something of that kind, and cyber attacks. All of these are catastrophes that could wipe out 1 billion people at a whack. And there are various public policies that could be introduced which will reduce the threat of each of them. And in fact, some of the same policies will reduce the threat of several of them because they are interdependent. So what we'll be doing here, the 30th and 31st of May, is considering the value of these a number of proposals that have been submitted, and we are continuing to receive. And we'll pick 25 of them, the most promising 25, because that's how many we can put on one sheet of paper. And we'll call that sheet of paper the platform for survival, because it's going to actually improve the probability of humankind's being able to survive and thrive. So those of you who've been watching this will see that the topics that I'm choosing for our Monday conversations are chosen specifically with the idea of finding things that are going to be able to help save the world. And so every week we come up with a different one. The first one was about the effect of militarism on climate change. The second week was about nuclear weapons and the effort to abolish them. And then tonight we've been talking about trees and global warming. This kind of conversation will go on every Monday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern time, indefinitely. But for the time being, they're all keyed to helping us understand some of the things that we need to know about in order to be intelligent in making the kinds of decisions that we'll be making on the 30th and 31st of May. So everybody watching this, I hope you'll consider registering. You can go to the website where we have a bibliography, and we have a lot of back videos, and we have the list of submissions to the platform for survival and a number of other things. The website is called tosavetheworld.ca, and you can register there. You can register as well by Eventbrite. If you go to Eventbrite and say you look for this event called How to Save the World in a Hurry, you'll be able to register for $100 for 2 days. Or if you're a student or unwaged, it's $40. So we're trying to make it easy for everybody to come and participate in this. And it's really a good idea to study a little bit in advance by watching these videos or by reading the materials on the bibliography and so on, so that when you come, you'll be really prepared to make some judgments about what we can do to put together a platform that a whole bunch of different NGOs and professionals could get behind and say, these would really make a difference in the prospects for humankind. Thank you all for watching, and thank you all, three of you, for making this wonderful contribution to our discussion tonight. And I'll see some of you, at least the viewers, back here Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So good night. Thank you.